the state building code is required to be applied statewide. The accessibility code is a chapter of the state building code, so that is included. And even in non-code enforced areas, like the small rural areas, small towns that don't have a code office, the accessibility code is still required to be enforced. So if they don't have a local code official, then it falls to the county.
Okay.
They can either hire a third party code official consultant to enforce it for them, would do the plan review and inspections, or they could partner with a neighboring jurisdiction that might have a code official as a joint powers
Okay.
um, type of relationship, or they could, their last option would be to ask the state.
Well, hello and welcome to the ADA Shop Talk podcast. I'm your host, Paul Klein, and if you are an ADA coordinator, government official, architect, or accessibility specialist trying to better understand the ADA, then you are in the right place. The ADA Shop Talk podcast is brought to you by BlueDag. Check out BlueDag's Transition Plan Builder and Inspection Suite over at bluedag.com. Well, today I have another great guest for you, someone I met many, many years ago out in California when she was taking some of our training classes to become a CASP, and I checked out her LinkedIn before the interview here, and she let her CASP expire in 2020. It looks like, at least that's what LinkedIn says. When you can't believe everything. But Karen Gridley, accessibility specialist with the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry. How are you doing today?
Good morning. I'm good. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Yeah. So is it true? Did you? I don't know if we want this in the interview or not, but did you had your CASP? I remember.
Yeah, I did. When I worked for Target Corporation, it made sense for me to have that, having stores in California and doing a lot of work in those stores and with those jurisdictions and the California building code. That made sense. But I've since moved on to the state of Minnesota as the Minnesota State Accessibility Specialist, and I hadn't used it for years, so I did. That was a calculated decision. I did let it go. It's expensive, as most of you know. It's expensive.
Yeah, and if you're not
and Target isn't paying for it anymore for me.
True.
Since I'm not with them any longer.
Well, you've immersed yourself in the Minnesota Accessibility Code and a code process that we're going to talk about. I've always referenced the Minnesota Code, and so I want to get into that with you and learn more because I have so many questions. But you mentioned Target, and I know that's where you were when I first met you. But tell our listeners a little bit more about your backstory and how you got into all this ADA and accessibility stuff that you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah, it's a little roundabout story. I'm sure many of us, we always end up in different places than we started out I have a degree in housing design and community development from the University of Minnesota, bachelor's degree from there. And after that, I went to work at a local architecture firm here in Minnesota, working with their in-house accessibility specialists, doing surveys for their clients, like for barrier removal and writing reports. So the clients could do transition plans, and then of course the architecture firm would help them, with drawings and creating the solutions for removing those barriers. That architecture firm happened to be one of the consulting architects for Target Corporation. So that's how I got connected with Target. And at one point they reached out to me and asked if I would be willing to join their in-house architecture firm. And I did. So I did that. And I worked with their architects in their construction department, and also with their law department on a lot of the accessibility lawsuits that came through. So I got to see the legal side of it from the litigation perspective, And obviously working with accessibility codes across the whole country, all states. Even in Canada, when we briefly had stores in Canada, I got to know the Canadian accessibility codes a bit. So that was interesting. And then also part of my time at Target, we got involved with the ANSI A117.1 committee. So I was a voting committee member on the A117 committee for a bit. And then after that, just some things fell into place, and I went to the state of Minnesota when my time at Target was done. And now I administer the state of Minnesota accessibility code. And I've been doing that for 9 years.
Oh, wow. 9 years. I was thinking it was only a couple of years, but
I know.
yeah, time does fly.
I was at Target for 12 and now at the state for 9. And then the architecture firm early on, 6 years.
Yeah. So. Yeah. I remember, not just Target. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of large corporates like Target. And, I think the perception out there with a lot of, especially, disabled access advocates, I know it's an underserved population that we have, and we can do better, but sometimes our perception that it's a big evil corporation and they don't care. But there's a lot of corporations like Target. I mean, you guys had a very comprehensive ADA compliance initiative, permit process. I mean, very proactive. I mean, the perception is, it's a big corp. They just build stores and don't care about access or people with disabilities. But the contrary is, at least my experience, and I'm assuming it's yours. So I'm looking for a confirmation here, but definitely speak your mind. But my experience has been that there are a lot of corporations do care about access, like Target and others similar to them, across the retail and food industry that really do take access serious. Has that been your perspective as well?
Course. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we tried our best to make sure we complied with the codes in every state across the country. And sometimes it gets a little bit challenging to juggle all the differences that you come across, and things get missed and fall through the cracks sometimes, but we would follow up with those as best we can and try to improve process, improve the prototype drawings so that they would capture, the most stringent part of the strategy at the time when I was there, to try and capture whichever code was the most stringent across the country and apply that prototypically, because when you're cranking out prototype typical stores one after the other, it's just so much easier when they're all the same.
Yeah.
But things get missed and things happen during construction, so it's just, you're always working to, make sure things are done correctly as best you can. But we tried. They still do have a code department. It's changed a little bit, but they do still have in-house code officials, building code officials. I believe, the current code official they have there is also CASP certified.
Oh,
I believe. And of course, I'm drawing a blank on his name. He's relatively new there. They've gone through a few, but they do still definitely care. Otherwise, they wouldn't have in-house code officials. Right. I don't know how many corporations do that.
Yeah, definitely. I remember they had some very out of the box thinking. I forget the gentleman's name that you were working with there that I met. I had the opportunity to come to the headquarters in Minnesota there and meet with you guys, and I remember the prototype plans, because I was also on the building department side before I was doing accessibility work, and it was just a neat approach to out of the box thinking, and I like that kind of stuff. Even though it maybe not work as well as you want it to, I always appreciated the effort to try to come up with new ideas.
It was a unique approach. For sure. It was fun working there.
Yeah. Well, now that we've moved on, and man, 9 years at the Minnesota department that you're working with, and I would assume the department you're working with is similar to DSA in California, or maybe the RAS, the Texas Accessibility. I forget the state agency that administers that, but I mean, I would say that's probably your counterpart for those two states. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have authority for schools, correctional facilities, and hospitals. So in our office and our building plan review team. Those are the projects that we review, and our inspectors, go out and inspect those projects. And then in addition to that, like I said, we do administer the state building code. So my division is in charge of all of the updates every code cycle. And we're right in the middle of that right now. Our state law requires our code to be updated only every 6 years.
Okay.
So quite a bit different than California's. I know California is kind of in perpetual code change mode with all the interim cycles and everything. But we're right in the middle of doing the code updates now. We just finished taking proposed comments and reviewing all of those with the stakeholders and technical advisory groups, and the accessibility code is part of that. So very similar to how Division of the State Architect is run in California. The big difference, though, is that we're much smaller, much smaller. I'm the only accessibility specialist.
For the agency.
For the agency, yeah. And part of that might be because we only review the code every 6 years. In between that, I do a lot of plan reviews. I do a couple other things. I host educational things a couple times a year so that I can teach our accessibility code to new code officials or code officials looking to get continuing education credits. So we have that responsibility to help with continuing education.
No, that's great. And so tell us a little bit more about specifically the Minnesota Accessibility Code. What is it mandated on the locals? In other words, your purview, like DSA and some other state agencies, for just state buildings or state regulated buildings, but does the adoption of the Minnesota Accessibility Code apply statewide to all jurisdictions and projects?
It does. I forget what year that came into effect. It's been quite a while. Might have been the 70s or 80s.
Oh,
but yeah, the state building code is required to be applied statewide. The accessibility code is a chapter of the state building code, so that is included. And even in non-code enforced areas, like the small rural areas, small towns that don't have a code office, the accessibility code is still required to be enforced. So if they don't have a local code official, then it falls to the county.
Okay.
They can either hire a third-party code official consultant to enforce it for them, would do the plan review and inspections, or they could partner with a neighboring jurisdiction that might have a code official as a joint powers type of relationship, or they could, their last option would be to ask the state to look at it for them, but almost none of them do that. Most of them are contracting with third-party building officials, who have their own consulting businesses to act as
the authority,
code official for the county. Yeah,
the authority having jurisdiction, and then they come in and just look at the MAC, the accessibility code.
Yeah, they'll only look at the accessibility code, even though the rest of the building code is required to be applied. The only thing that's required to be enforced is the accessibility code. So building owners are just on their own to apply the rest of the building code correctly.
Yeah, I see. And so the third party comes in, we'll check for parking, ramps, the grab bars and everything. Now, is there any kind of along with a certificate of occupancy, like a final form or anything that goes to the state or anything like that?
No, we don't have anything like that, like the CASP program does. And I know Texas has a program like that. We don't require any projects in Minnesota to, fill out any additional paperwork or forms certifying that they're compliant with the accessibility code. It's just they treat it just like the rest of the building code. Once the certificate of occupancy is signed, that covers anything under the state code.
I see. And then if there's
if it's the fire or the plumbing or accessibility or et cetera.
And then if there's an issue or challenge, then theoretically someone either through a civil lawsuit or regulatory agency review says, hey, who is your third party on this? This ramp is at 14.5%.
Right.
And I would imagine it's a civil issue at that point, but at
It
least.
is, and you typically, so the way that the litigation has kind of gone in Minnesota, um, a few years back, just like, most other states, there are a few parties that, proactively look for violations and connect with the building owners to try and get those resolved through legal matters. There was one in particular who was an attorney. He ended up losing his license because he was a predatory type. Just, he didn't care about the barrier removal. All he did was collect the money and
Sounds like California.
never followed up with the building owner to see if the barriers were removed. It was just
Yeah.
the threat of it. So because of that, and there were a couple others like that, there was a new state law passed that requires anyone who wants to file a complaint um, regarding accessibility barriers on a business is that they have to, and I'm not going to get all the details exactly right because it's been a while since I looked at it, but they have to give them some time to respond and the opportunity to do the barrier removal before they just threaten legal action. And because of that, those parties that choose to still pursue legal matters are not filing under Minnesota law. So they're not engaging the Minnesota Accessibility Code. They're only filing under the federal,
right? Just
in
like
federal
California.
court.
Yep.
Yeah. And so, it's hard for business owners who, I get calls from a lot of them that think they're doing the right thing. They're like, I just put this new curb ramp in, that it looks fine, but they're telling me it's off by 0.5%.
Right. Yeah.
It's hard. And they want their local code official to come and help. But the hard part about that is, our state code officials, we're licensed by the state. We're state agents.
Mm-hmm.
So we only have authority to address the state code. We can't address the federal
right.
lawsuit. But we try as best we can to kind of, um, help the building owners with what the codes require.
Yeah.
If they're going to do work, then they would have to pull a permit. Then our code officials can engage with them.
Right.
Once they pull a permit.
Yeah, that's such the case everywhere. I mean, there's a lot of states like Minnesota, that have their own accessibility code. I'm thinking of the Oregon accessibility code, California, of course, Texas, Florida has a wonky, double blue line, and there has to be a lav in the bathroom, which is kind of cool. But and of course New York and Jersey up in that way has some stuff, and up in where is that, Maine, and anyway a lot of places.
There are a few.
Yeah. And that's always a challenge where the code official only has purview over the building code and not the obviously the ADA, but where states have merged the two standards together, we're seeing some improvement there, and that brings up a question with the Minnesota Accessibility Code. Is it based on the ADA, the 2010 ADAS, or is it ANSI based? Usually, it's one of those two.
It is IBC ANSI based.
Okay.
Originally, our state accessibility code was based on the federal ADA, but that's back when in the early 90s when it was brand new. And more current than some of the things that IBC was doing. But since then, it's the ADA is, it's based on the 2003 A117.1 at this point. So, and in the meantime, the IBC and A117.1 has been marching on with, more changes and more advances. So Minnesota wanted to keep up with some of those. We don't have a state law that requires us to adopt the federal ADA, which I think California does. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know that it adopts the Division of State Architects certainly used it as its model code for in writing 11B. So instead of the ANSI or the IBC based code, they use the 2010 ADAS as its basis.
Yeah.
And then there was Mark, my partner in CalCast, who, it was on the committee with Jim Terry and a group that went through that with a fine tooth comb to inject all the California more restrictive stuff. But that's because in California, there was access laws for, many years before the ADA came along. But for other states, like I would assume like Minnesota, ANSI is the better route because it's more up to date, and it's instead of being updated every 30 years, it's updated, every
right. Exactly. Yeah. So we wanted to keep up with those more current standards. And that's not to say we don't have plenty of our own amendments. We do amend some things in that are unique to Minnesota that I haven't seen anywhere else. But yeah, we're primarily based on IBC and A117.1.
And are you on the 09 or have you adopted the new, what is it, 17 or 18?
Currently it's the IBC 2018, and then the code cycle we're going through right now will pick up through the 2024.
Okay. Is it the 2024 ANSI that's coming?
No, the ANSI is the most recent ANSI that's available for use is 2017.
Okay, 17. All right. Okay.
And that committee just finished going through their public comments for the next edition of the A117.1. But that won't be published probably for another year.
Okay.
2025, I think they're shooting for. Kim Perlberg would be the one to confirm the dates for where they are with that.
That's right. Yeah, with ICC.
Yeah.
So the Minnesota Accessibility Code is based on the 2017 ANSI.
2018 IBC with the 2017
ANSI.
No, I'm sorry, 2009 A117.1. Yeah, it's a number soup. Instead of alphabet soup, it's a number soup.
Oh, it is. Okay. It is so for the technical standards, chapters 3 through 10, it's the 09 ANSI, and then your scoping is in the 18 IBC. Okay. So for those of you listening that used to dealing with the ADAS, there's the scoping chapter in chapter 2. And for those not familiar with the ANSI process, you go to the IBC for scoping, and which is the chapter 11 in the International Building Code. That's like the parallel to the chapter 2 of the ADAS. And then for technical 3 through 10, states like Minnesota, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Karen, would reference the 2009 or the 2017 ANSI A117, depending on which one they adopt. Because the ANSI only has the technical, it doesn't have the scoping, is what I'm trying to say. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, at this point, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about what are some key differences. I mean, maybe I'll just kind of pick up some elements. Like, is there anything different with path of travel for a typical retail or office building in Minnesota that stands out, or is that pretty on par?
So for decades now, Minnesota has, California has this too. So I think for a while, Minnesota and California were the only ones. We require a 48-inch wide exterior accessible route. For us, it was because of snow.
Yeah.
If you think of a typical sidewalk outside, if it's only 36 inches wide, and with all the snow we get by the end of the season, even if you do a really good job of shoveling, at some point there's just not a lot of room to put the snow, and it starts encroaching closer and
so
closer.
True.
You get this narrower little path just because. And so if you start out with a wider route to begin with, it's a little better. It helps.
Yeah.
So we've got that. The other thing, then the big one for Minnesota is the slope of our exterior accessible routes for new construction is only allowed to be a 1:20 maximum slope. So, which means no ramps are allowed, because by definition, as most of you know, a ramp isn't a ramp until it exceeds 1:20.
Right.
And so the slang language in Minnesota is that ramps are not allowed outside in Minnesota. But the way the code language is written, it gives you a list of components that you're allowed to use outside, and it lists a 1 to 20 walking slope, curb cuts, um, doors and compliant doors and doorways. And by the absence of the word ramp in the code section, that's how it comes about in code language, that ramps are not allowed outside.
Okay, so that's a big one. So on an exterior project in Minnesota, if you have a 6 or 8 inch curb at a parking stall coming off the access aisle, you can't use a curb ramp there?
You can. Curb ramps are allowed.
Oh, okay.
So a curb ramp is a different element from a ramp.
Okay, pedestrian ramp versus
So
curb
curb
ramp.
ramps are still allowed. It's just that once you've navigated the curb ramp, you can't continue the slope at a ramp slope. You'd have to grade it so that the slope, once you're off of the curb ramp and off the landing of the curb ramp, would have to be 1 to 20 or less.
Okay.
And I emphasize that's for new construction, because we realize that there are a lot of old sites or
I was going to
existing
say,
conditions where that could be technically infeasible. So we have an allowance for alterations to existing buildings, and existing sites that says where it's technically infeasible to fully comply, then you just have to comply to the maximum extent technically feasible.
okay.
Essentially, do the best that you can with the space that you have to work
Right.
with. So we do. It's not to say we don't have any ramps in Minnesota. We certainly do. Because of older buildings that had them and site constraints. But for new construction, the expectation is to hit that 1 to 20 max
Yeah.
for the accessible route.
Well, it makes sense too, especially with all the snow. I mean, a 1 in 12 is pretty slippery when there's ice on there. So I could see that being I could see Minnesota making a good case for that amendment or
yeah, that's exactly the point. So thank you for mentioning that. I mean, our advocates were pretty adamant about this, and we've had this requirement since '99.
Okay.
So it's long standing in Minnesota, and they continue to tell us how important it is, because of our long winter season. I mean, we can have snow in October, as early as October and as late as May.
Oh, wow.
It's a really, really long winter season. And even if it isn't snow, sometimes it can be freezing rain. And, those shoulder seasons can have slippery conditions, and trying to wheel up a slope, steeper than 1 to 20 can be really, really difficult for some people, especially if they have strength limitations. And even if you use a walker or canes, that can be hazardous too, not just for mobility devices or wheelchairs.
Absolutely. No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And boy, that's a big one. How about path of travel improvements? Like if you're doing an alteration or a remodel to an existing building, I know in the ADAS there's 20% of the primary functional area, and then barrier removal, of course. Does the Minnesota Accessibility Code have anything related to that? Okay.
Yeah, we do. And we pull that from that scoping comes from the International Existing Building Code.
Okay.
So from ICC, and that scoping is in there. They do, we call, the 20% rule. We have a version of that. And it's just the national version. We haven't amended that in Minnesota. So which is pretty, what they have.
Which is pretty on par with the ADA. So it's not as complex and convoluted as California.
Right.
With
Yeah. There isn't like the valuation.
Right.
Like California has. Yeah.
That's good. Well, you hit us with some two big ones. 48-inch accessible route in Minnesota. Also on new construction, no ramps, although there's some exceptions for existing and so forth, and site constraints. Those are two pretty big ones. What else do you got in that code that we want to know about? Any other, whether it's interior, exterior, bathrooms?
Yeah. Yep. The other one that comes to mind is, it's another one that's California has had for a while too, is the depth of the toilet compartment.
Okay.
Wheelchair accessible toilet compartments. We've required 48 inches in front of the toilet for decades. And a couple code cycles ago, we added an option that it could be either 48 in front of the toilet or 78 inches measured off the back wall.
Okay.
And what we've seen is designers are moving towards that dimension more than the 48 in front of the toilet, because toilets can come in so many different
Right.
sizes. You specify one, but a different one shows up on site and they'll install it, and then it's too big, and that now you only have 46 inches in front of the toilet.
Yeah.
But the overall depth is still there, so it still allows for getting in and maneuvering in the compartment.
That's a good one. Yeah. Cause a toilet can range from 28 off the back wall all the way to 31, 32. And
Right.
that's always a challenge. And I would assume, isn't there a change in the new ANSI to a bigger toilet compartment? Or I remember
There is, that's coming, and that's a huge change. I was, when we just went through our code change cycle, I was bracing for lots of pushback and comments on it, but it was relatively well accepted. So we'll see how it goes once it starts getting applied.
Yeah.
But yeah, the 2017 edition of the A117.1 enlarged, and I guess it's not so much that it enlarged the toilet compartment. What it enlarged is the building blocks for the turning
That's
spaces.
right. Yeah. 66 inches or something like that.
Went to 67 inches,
Okay.
and the T turn has 3 different options.
Okay.
So, in a toilet compartment isn't required to have a turning space in it, but a toilet room does. So that's really going to impact spaces more like vestibules, smaller toilet rooms, a few other places where the turning space is actually required.
Yeah.
But the first thought is everybody's like, they think it's going to impact the toilet compartment.
Yeah.
But once you look at the language a little bit, it's not as bad as you think. So, and that may be why we didn't get as much pushback. Once you look at the language, it's going to impact some spaces in a building, but maybe not as many as at first glance.
Right.
When you first
right.
hear about it.
No, that's excellent. So yeah, that's those are excellent. Now, so you got the 48 at the front of the water closet, 48-inch wide accessible rod on the exterior. No ramps in Minnesota. There's three big differences between the regular, I guess the main codes and or state specific amendments that you have. What else do you have cooking in there? Anything with grab bars or
well, the
or
other
labs?
2 big things, California is always at the leading edge of these things, but Minnesota's right behind. Oh my gosh, has it been almost 2 years already? Our governor passed expedited rulemaking that requires us to incorporate rules for adult changing facilities in our Minnesota accessibility code. So that is being published. It'll be published in our state register by the end of November.
Okay.
And then our state law requires a 270-day waiting period before it becomes enforceable. So once it's published end of November, with that 270 days, it will be enforceable probably by August of 2025.
Okay.
So we'll pick that up. We modeled that after the work that the A117.1 committee just finished on that. And that'll also be included in their next edition of the ANSI document as well. And then we also picked up some requirements for accessible electric vehicle charging.
I was wondering about that.
Stations.
Yeah.
And we modeled that after what the guidance was at the time. The U.S. Access Board had some guidance that they published in June. I think it was relatively recently. But now they're accepting public comment for another version.
Right.
So we'll see how that changes. So we'll try to keep up with that.
Yeah.
So yeah, those will be new in Minnesota. Picking those things up.
Yeah, no, those are excellent and make a lot of sense. The other one I was going to ask you about in Minnesota is, and I think I know the answer because it's in the ANSI, is when it comes to fair housing and a multifamily. If I remember right, ANSI includes accessible units for mobility and transient lodging, public housing. Then it has like a unit A and a B for adaptable units, which mirrors kind of the fair housing. But correct me if I'm wrong. Does Minnesota Accessibility Code also address the fair housing and multifamily apartments as well?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we follow the scoping from IBC for, and we go by occupancy classification. So R1s, R2s, R3s, and R4s pick up different levels of accessibility for the dwelling units. And then for the design of the dwelling units, it's the A117.1, Chapter 10, and there's 3 levels of accessibility. The fully accessible unit, which is what you'd see in the R1s, your hotels and motels. Then the adaptable unit that you mentioned, that's called a type A unit.
That's right. You type A.
And that A stands for adaptable. A lot of people get confused and think that the A in type A means accessible, but it
right.
means adaptable. And then what the A117.1 has for the type B unit is the least accessible kind of unit, but that's the type of unit that mirrors the FHA requirements.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes, and the accessible unit is what I equate to a mobility unit, for transient lodging in the ADAS and CBC. And so I kind of, when I'm jumbling these together, I try to keep, I wish they would all use the same terms, but that's how I keep it in my mind, is that's like the highest level of accessibility in a transient lodging or public housing setting. And then the type A is an adaptable unit, and then B is even less than that. So,
yeah. So that's what we've got in Minnesota. And we mostly follow the model codes. We've got a couple, I guess there's one more amendment that we make for the type B units that catches a lot of contractors and designers off guard. And it's in dwelling units that have a balcony or a patio, that the national code allows a 4-inch
drop.
But Minnesota has modified that to be only allowed to be a 2-inch drop.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah. So that catches a lot of them off guard, and that one's a hard one to fix, because if it gets built, that's a hard one to, because it's, you're tying those structures together, and
lightweight concrete, wood joist, whatever they might be doing out there. And
right.
And that's a big one. And that 4-inch in our community, the ADA Shop Talk community, there was someone, I had posted a question about the 4-inch drop, and it's counterintuitive, but allowed in the Fair Housing Act. And I think it was one of those industry buy-offs for drainage, and the Window Manufacturer Association, for drainage purposes and so forth. But nothing says a state can't go more restrictive. And
right, which is what we did. And the reason that they did that is because again, our advocates are telling us it's easier to get like one of those little portable threshold adapters to make just that 2-inch, and the slope is still relatively reasonable to be able to navigate it. It's still pretty steep, but better than 4 inches.
Yeah.
And then that 2 inches still allows so that we don't get water intrusion into the unit and runoff, and in the winter, snow drifts pile up really high.
So it's you got bigger problems than water intrusion with 8 foot of snow on your back window. So
well, once it starts to melt, then you get
that's true. That's true. No, those are all excellent. That's super helpful. That clarifies a lot of things. Those are some big differences in Minnesota. And I'll close with this, because I know we're coming up on our time here. But when it comes to the MAC and your local agencies, there's a Title II requirement on the feds for all Title II entities, cities and counties, to have a transition plan and provide program access and all that. Do the cities and counties in Minnesota, do they typically use both, like in California, the MAC and the ADA for that, or do you?
They're supposed to. Some of them are better about that than others. The big, Minneapolis, St. Paul, the big cities are better about that. Some of the small rural jurisdictions, it's like they don't know what they don't know kind of a
Yeah.
thing. But they know they need to comply with the Minnesota Accessibility Code. And yeah, I'm not sure how many of them are aware that they're still obligated to comply with the federal rule too, if there's anything that's more stringent.
Yeah.
That,
So just like a lot of other states that have a more restrictive code, if there's a trigger via either barrier removal or program access for a Title II entity and an alteration is embarked on, say to fix the parking and the accessible route into the building, then they need to look at not only the ADAS, but also the Minnesota Accessibility Code. And although the ADAS would allow a ramp on the exterior at 8.33, that would be for new construction, so that might not be applicable. But a better one would be a 36-inch wide path of travel. They would need to go with the MAC 48, just like California.
right. Yeah. I will say though that the next edition of the A117 has also moved to the 48-inch wide exterior accessible route. So they're catching up
Yeah, and
nationally.
I think the PROAG also, there was something in the PROAG.
Does it?
That was
Okay.
similar, and maybe it was around an obstruction. I know there was some gnashing of the teeth and then that's still in its adoption phase and comment phase, I believe. But there was one change in there last
That would
August.
make sense. Yeah, that would make
And
sense.
which a lot of the civil engineers were not happy with because there was an allowance allowed. But that's how these codes develop. We get better each time and learn
Absolutely.
more. So
Yeah,
and
for sure.
well, great. Last question for you. I know I said last, but this is the last one. What advice do you have for your new accessibility specialists? You've been doing this a long time, like I have, but there's a lot of listeners that are new to this or just became the ADA coordinator. But what advice do you have for new accessibility specialists or ADA coordinators that might be struggling with implementing the ADA or understanding accessibility in the built environment?
Oh my gosh. Um, I just based on how I figured it out, because there's no college or 4-year degree for it, so we're all kind of like figuring it out as we go. And I guess the thing I did that ended up being most helpful, well, a couple things is just sitting down with the code books and like pick a topic like accessible parking and look for all of the sections that have to do with that. And that really helped me understand the difference between scoping sections
Mm,
and the technical design sections and how they work together. And it helped me find all the different places in the book where it comes up or where there's requirements that apply to that topic. And I would just sit and read the book. And, when I was back working at the architecture firm in Target, we would travel a lot for our clients. So I was on airplanes. I'd take my code book out for a couple hours on the airplane, and that's where I would just study it. And
yeah.
even after I got my certifications, there's still like lots to understand and learn. So just keep your nose in the books.
Yeah.
Just study them and figure it out. And it took me forever to figure out that the A117.1 was the scoping or I'm sorry, the technical design criteria, and the scoping came from
IBC.
IBC
Yeah.
language, and the federal ADA kind of mishmashes scoping and technical all in one.
Yeah.
Um, and because of all of the different books and parts and pieces, I just took the time to sit down with the books and dissect them and to help me understand how they work together and seeing where the differences are and which one understanding which one supersedes the other. Like typically we all know the more stringent always supersedes the less, or the more specific always supersedes the less specific if you're trying to decide between two things that seem to be in conflict.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess keep your nose in the books is what I would say.
Keeping your nose in the book. That's so true. That's just pick an element and go deep dive,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
just try to learn as much as you can about that one thing and everything. And is there a Minnesota certification? Like, can you get certified as a Minnesota accessibility specialist like other states or like Texas?
Yeah,
Or
we do have a Minnesota Accessibility Specialist certification. that people choose to do. It's a little bit different than what California and Texas have because, like, we mentioned earlier, we don't require businesses to go through an accessibility certification process. It's just part of your regular building code inspection process. But what people use the certification for a lot of times is to become independent consultants, set up shop and do their own accessibility consulting. And then they will get hired by various businesses to come and survey the property just to do transition plans or to help with lawsuits, help.
Okay. And is that administered through the state? Like, can you sign up through how often is the exam? I mean,
yep, the exam. So you have to first take a class. It's a week-long class for the building official limited license. And one day of that week, I teach the accessibility portion of that.
Okay.
So if you only want the accessibility specialist certification, you would come for that one day that I teach that class. And then after that, you qualify to take the exam. It's not a hard exam. It's not like the CASP exam. It's open book. And it's not hard.
Yeah. Well, still, it'd be a good one to have. I just got my APA certification last year, and I did one of the first episodes I did in the podcast was about all the different certifications, and I didn't know about the Minnesota one. Otherwise, I would have mentioned it. So now I'm intrigued.
It's a sleeper.
Yeah, it's a sleeper, but
people in Minnesota mostly use it or consulting with people who have new disabilities and need to modify their home. So like occupational therapists will take it. One of our other state agencies requires, don't quote me on this, it's another healthcare professional, whether it's an occupational therapist or one of those types of jobs is required to get their accessibility specialist license just so they understand what the codes are in Minnesota. Even though you can customize someone's home for what they need, it kind of gives a place to start.
Yeah. It gives a good baseline.
So Well, when I teach the class, it's very, very basic. I mean, if you're thinking of taking it, Paul, I mean, you could probably teach it based on what you know. But so we have to keep it very basic because of the nature of some of the people who are taking it. Like they've never looked at a plan before ever. So
right. Very green folks, but that's good. It's a step in the right direction. And is there a web page that I can include in the show notes? That
there is. I can give you our DLI website. It takes a little bit of navigating. If you want a better one, I could email it to you later.
Yeah.
Is that more helpful?
Yeah. If you could email it, I'll include it in the show notes. And
okay.
And we'll put that in there in case anybody's interested in becoming MAC certified, if you will. And And also, I want to thank you so much for coming on. But did you? What's the best way folks can? Is email okay or your webpage?
Sure, they could email me. Sure. Do you want me to spell it out, or are you going to put it in?
No, I'll put it in the. I just want to get permission before I blast it on the podcast because some people prefer phone, some people prefer email. So. If you have any questions, if you're working in Minnesota, you're involved in the architectural accessibility space and need help, Karen is a great resource. And thank you so much for coming on today. And this has been super, super, super helpful and informative for me. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, we'll talk to you soon, fun. And we'll have another episode for you shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.